Hey guys, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 30 cheat sheet ahead of the Game Week 30 deadline. As far as how this video will work, I will not be considering 3 hits in terms of the cheat sheet. The strength of the assets here are actually considering all the fixtures here. There are going to be people who will be wildcarding in 33. Therefore, you only really need to consider Game Weeks 30, 31, and 32. If you have a free hit and you're playing 3 at 34, because for whatever reason you may not have rated United and Chelsea in their fixture run, and you have Liverpool assets instead, you could play towards 3 at 34, particularly also trying to sidestep some City assets. If you have, let's say, 3 at 32, and you're tempted to go into City assets, United assets, and even Chelsea assets, then of course you need to take into account how a team like Arsenal are not going to be particularly appealing to you because you would already get the Arsenal players in 32, which is arguably their best fixture alongside that West Ham away fixture. But you have to take all of that into account. However, this cheat sheet doesn't, in terms of this assumes you have no chips left for the most part, but I will still be talking about the strength of some assets and whether they're viable based on different chip strategies. As far as the actual movements this week in the cheat sheet, you can see both the West Ham assets have fallen, and that's simply because after that really positive double game week from an attacking point of view, I would say the strength of those assets aren't particularly there. West Ham ultimately have to play Arsenal at home and then Liverpool at home, 2 really tough fixtures. They do have Fulham and Bournemouth, and the nice thing about Fulham and Bournemouth is that they have been pretty terrible as defensive teams, even at home. So that's going to be a bit of a benefit if you own Benrahma or Bowen. The reason why they both fall, though, simply is because I still rate now that we have mostly single game weeks Arsenal assets over them, and that's just the lay of the land. And the same thing with Brighton assets, where we already know that they're such a capable attacking outfit. It doesn't really matter whether Mitoma, March, McAllister get a goal or an assist in a different game. They're just going to have a higher ceiling and even a floor week to week compared to a West Ham asset when you look at the overall chance creation that each team has been able to present versus some really tough opponents, such as the ones that Brighton have had lately. As far as Benrahma, he also had slightly less minutes in the previous week, and that's just going to be a reality. He does simply play less minutes than someone like Bowen in the Premier League. Bowen is like a 90-minute player. Benrahma something close to maybe 65 to 85, depending on how well he's playing. Benrahma, however, is on penalty, so that's going to be a huge plus if you continue to keep him. And of course, I would advise keeping him for 30 and 32 in particular. As far as the City assets, you'll see that 4 City assets have been invited onto the cheat sheet, and that's because the change in City's tactical structure is now allowing City to play this sort of 3-2-5 structure where effectively you have 3 center backs, and of course Walker could be one of those center backs as well in the right center back position. He could of course be replaced by someone like Akanji, but you mostly now see something like Ake, Diaz plus another center back, and then Stones and Rodri both playing as effectively defensive mids. And then you have a front five that is supported by usually Gundogan and De Bruyne, although they can still be replaced by, let's say, a Bernardo Silva and an Alvarez. And then a front three, which is quite natural, that is going to be also Haaland, Mahrez, and someone like Grealish. As far as Foden, he can find his way towards this team, but we know that he has appendicitis, and I think he's recovering from that. And as far as Alvarez, of course, you can see him replacing Kevin De Bruyne in some games, but also maybe replacing Erling Haaland if Pep finds an opportunity to, let's say, rest Haaland. Although I think that's going to be rather unlikely because it seems like Erling is back to full fitness. However, that still means that nailed City assets are your best bets here, and that's why Grealish finds himself as a top asset as well. Mahrez is an interesting one, and I would say you need to treat Mahrez with caution. Mahrez has been listed as a green asset because I think with City having double game weeks in the future and expecting that a lot of people have this 3 at 32 line of play, I do think Mahrez has really good dividends because Foden is out for this fixture run. So the actual minutes that Mahrez will get, even though we know he's mostly a Champions League player for Pep, could be a little bit higher than usual when we come back to looking at his minutes in the Premier League. That was something that we saw earlier this season when they were in the group stages, where Man City actually utilized both Mahrez in the Premier League and also in the Champions League. Whether that remains to be the case is something that remains to be seen. I would actually probably look at the Southampton game to assess whether Mahrez can be trusted to play in the Premier League and the UCL simultaneously this week, as opposed to going to Mahrez this week. For me, the week to go for City midfielders is actually going to be on Game Week 31 if you are someone who's moving towards a free hit 32 template. As far as someone like Maddison, why he drops, the simple reality is, of course, you've just come over this double game week, which was really positive for Leicester. I would say that they probably had the best odds to do well. And Barnes was actually the goal scorer in that game there. And I've simply just nerfed Maddison towards the level of Barnes. I think Barnes has always been a very consistent asset. We know that he doesn't really have a high ceiling, which is illustrated by the fact that he never gets bonus points. He's actually gotten 0 bonus points this season, which is basically the tail of the tape there. Whereas someone like Madison, different story there, where I think he's had at least 7 to 8. So with Madison, he still has his Bournemouth fixture, so I would advise keeping him, of course, for this week. But going forward, I'd still probably consider selling him if you have free at 32, just because that will be a City midfielder, because game week 32 is not something that's going to be in your consideration. You would get rid of Madison when he plays City, and also game week 33, not exactly the best fixture now that Leeds have shown to be a little bit more of a capable side. So that's what I think is going to be the reality of FPL, and Odegaard rises towards the level of someone like a Madison, simply because even though they have 2 very, very tough away fixtures within their next 4 game weeks in terms of City and Liverpool, you can still see that Arsenal have ample opportunities to do well. And as one of the best attacks in the league, Odegaard, being a 90-minute man, is going to benefit from that when playing West Ham and Southampton. So that's why he re-rises after coming off of a single game week where other assets might have been preferred as a transfer out. He is now going to be one of those transfers back, maybe in the future. However, of course, it really just depends on whether you have the free hit or not. As far as the forwards this week, the change here is going to be Isak falling and Wilson being added to the cheat sheet. Wilson showcased a really good game versus West Ham, and we even saw an opportunity for Isak to come off the bench and score, which is something that's going to create a lot of problems, in my opinion, for Eddie Howe. Now, there is a possibility that Isak could be playing on the left wing position, which will maybe supplement Wilson in time, where we get to see both starting. But Newcastle primarily play this 4-3-3 formation, so it's hard to see whether Isak and Wilson's minutes would not be kind of conflating with each other. So I would say Isak has to drop for that reason, because they probably will have to continue sharing minutes over the course of the season as we head towards game week 38. And the fact that Isak needed to be rested over kind of a short fixture run or short rest period suggests that maybe in future double game weeks, Isak might not be as strong of an option as we thought. So that's going to be one concern there. And Wilson, of course, showcased, as I said, a really good performance. So that's going to be something that we'll have to kind of assess going forwards. As far as Vinicius, he is someone who joins the budget forwards as an option. The run for Fulham is actually fantastic this week, but I don't really see why you'd be wasting that transfer now. It's also worth just seeing whether Marco Silva will be making some tactical amendments to their style of play and the structure, given that Mitrovic has this 8-game ban that he's already served 1 game from. And so we'll need to see what happens with Vinicius going forwards. I think he could be a great differential by the time, let's say, something like game week 32 comes around, if you're not a free hit template. But otherwise, he's probably one to monitor for the next 2 game weeks before you actually jump the gun on him. Because even game week 34 is a double game week for Fulham, but it's a terrible one. It's slightly okay from the attacking point of view, hoping that you'd be able to bank versus Liverpool, but I still think it's a very, very tough game week. And Johnson just not really an interesting option. Solanke and Ferguson still both interesting options. Solanke had really, really good underlying stats, and the reason why Solanke has remained on the cheat sheet as opposed to being kind of booted out after this double game week is because the fixtures are actually very positive for Bournemouth, and we've also seen that their underlying stats have trended up. So the fact that Solanke is getting all these chances, and we saw that in game week 29 where he had an XG of something like 2+, is going to be really beneficial if you're a Solanke owner, where maybe on a week like game week 32 or on a week like game week 33, even on game week 30, you'd consider starting him over some of the weaker players in your team. As far as someone like Ferguson, the issue still is going to be minutes and starts. So I still think he pales in comparison to these other Brighton assets, and that's kind of why we have to see Ferguson still at as a second-tier asset. If we look at the 7.0 to 7.9 price bracket, Jesus is someone who immediately rises for me. Now, Liverpool and a game at Anfield is not really the fixture where you want to transfer in Jesus, but I think we know what Jesus' ceiling is, and we know that his minutes are being managed, but they're only really going to trend upwards week on week. So I do feel like it's responsible now to actually move Jesus towards a tier 1 asset, because we will probably see him continue to start games, and maybe he plays 60-65 minutes versus Liverpool, but going forwards we could see him going back to a landscape where he is getting something like 80 minutes at the very bare minimum. So that's a huge positive when you look at fixtures like West Ham and Southampton. Now, of course, City is another poor game, but you can manage that, right? If you get the upside of Jesus in some other fixtures. It's the same sort of logic with how strong and deep our teams are. You will have these Brighton assets, for example, on game week 33 to cover for a Jesus who plays versus City on game week 33. So that's why Jesus rises. Havertz and Felix both fall. And this isn't simply because I don't rate Lampard for whatever reason, but we've just come over double game week. Chelsea will be hit with an impending blank. We also don't know whether Lampard will change things up when it comes to the attackers and things like that. And whether, for example, he will rate Havertz maybe as highly as someone like Potter did, because the huge benefit that Havertz had was, first of all, he was on penalties, which I think he will stay on. However, you don't know whether Havertz will be someone that Lampard will seek to, let's say, take off after 70, 75 minutes. With Potter, he was a bit of a 90-minute man, so that's a huge change there. And with Felix, it's a similar situation where maybe Lampard could rate Felix higher or a bit lower, but now I think it's the time to exercise a bit of caution with Chelsea. And simply put, I think we can say as well that Lampard has struggled to get an offense running. Now, Potter is probably guilty of the same if you look specifically at the tenor with Chelsea, but that's the issue. Lampard just hasn't really showcased the ability to bring, say, Premier League level offense, and Everton was a good example of that, where you can see Everton's underlying stats from an XG point of view per game actually rise a lot more with Sean Dyche than when Lampard was actually the manager there in Everton. So I'm expecting that could probably hamper Chelsea a little bit. And they're already a team that struggles to finish. As far as the other top tier assets, no changes there. Darwin is probably going to be someone who rises towards the top for me in Game Week 32, but still Arsenal are one of the best away defenses. Now Liverpool are an absolute fortress at Anfield, but with Darwin, you also have to kind of dampen your expectations a little bit, because it's not like he's guaranteed to start every single game. So that could be one concern there as we head into Game Week 30. As far as the defenders this week, we are looking at a landscape where these Arsenal assets have risen back towards the top, and that's simply because coming after that single game week, which was not going to be high ceiling as some of the United, the Chelsea, the Newcastle assets, you're now going back to a landscape where mostly people have single game weeks, and Arsenal are one of the best defenses in the league, so they therefore have to rise back towards the top. And I've kept the Brighton assets there because I really don't see the reason to sell. Ultimately, you're going to have one Brighton asset, and I don't really think that there's any reason to sell. Yes, the fixtures are tough, but then you already get them back on Game Week 33, and they're season keepers, really. That's just the landscape with the Brighton defense. As far as the Newcastle defenders, the interesting thing here is a lot of people are going to own Trippier. So my assumption and why Botman and Burn and even Shar are still classed as yellow tier assets as opposed to orange or green assets is going to be that fixture run. It's much worse than Arsenal's fixture run. I don't really see too many chances of them keeping a clean sheet. Ultimately, Brentford and Aston Villa have been very capable teams in at least scoring one goal versus their opponents, particularly at home. And then with the Tottenham fixture, that's going to be a tough game with Tottenham away from home even. And then with Everton, that's where you start to see the strength of Newcastle assets rise again. And probably that's where we'll see those Newcastle assets rise towards that green territory again. As far as Mings, Pedro Porro, these sorts of players, and even Martinez has been added to the cheat sheet because we know that Luke Shaw is confirmed to be out for this week. So Luke Shaw seems like he could be back as soon as Game Week 31, but I think there is a risk that he might not make it there, which is going to be a huge problem. Therefore, you might want to consider going for a United defender to side grade there, because these two back-to-back fixtures for United are perfect on paper to look for and envision clean sheets. The difference here as well with someone like Martinez is you know that he'll be nailed as a center back here for Ten Hag, whereas with the City assets that you're going for, there still is always going to be an asterisk. Someone like Stones could have managed minutes, someone like Diaz could have managed minutes. And the reality is when you're calling on Laporte from the bench, it's much different to, let's say, calling on someone like Maguire from the bench, at least from the point of view of how much, let's say, Eric Ten Hag trusts a Maguire versus how much Pep would trust a Laporte in a league game. So that's kind of my concern here, and why I think Martinez becomes a very, very solid, viable asset to go for in Game Week 30. As far as Mings and Pedro Porro, just going quickly back to them, I think they actually have good fixtures overall. They seem like two players that are nailed. You could obviously think about Alex Moreno looking at the same Aston Villa team, but Mings for me is someone that you don't really have to deal like any sort of minute situation with, because of course Moreno still has to share minutes at times with Luka Dean. As far as Zuma, he also rises too, just because if you really wanted, let's say, a flexible fourth or fifth option coming from your defense and a differential that can actually attack like we saw in the previous week, then Zuma is your guy. For the rest of the season now, we'll be calling on some defenders, and potentially with a lot of us rotating defenders and even having a weaker defense now with Shaw out, an option like Zuma does seem quite appealing. However, the fixtures in terms of Fulham, I would say, away are quite tough. Bournemouth is probably the only clean sheet opportunity I see, and therefore, if you're a 3-hit-32 player, Zuma is not going to be even in your consideration. However, keeping Zuma towards the rest of the season makes sense because West Ham will eventually have some better games, and you could play him selectively in some games there. This is only really going to be applicable to wildcarding players. As far as 5.0 to 5.4 assets, Shaw, as I said, drops because he will be confirmed out for Game Week 30. And the situation is that I still think he is the highest ceiling United defender, but he's not going to be a transfer in until potentially Game Week 34, because keep in mind that Game Week 33 is going to be a tough game versus Tottenham. And if he misses the Game Week 31 game, that's going to be a huge issue. So I would even consider going for Martinez in that week, for example, just to actually capitalize on something like a Nottingham Forest game. And that's kind of my position on Shaw. As far as the 5.5 plus assets, James does rise a little bit. We have to temper our expectations with someone like James, who has found it so frequently the case to get himself re-injured. And I do worry about keeping James as an asset, and that's why I went for Chilwell instead. Chilwell also having really, really good underlying numbers, and positive to see as well that Chilwell is very capable of getting bonus points. He does seem to be a little bit more involved in terms of general passing through the system, but of course James has that threat of being able to score or even to create something from nothing, and that's kind of the concern there when James was actually almost scored, I think, a disallowed goal in the previous double game week. So that is the ceiling that James can bring to the table, but I think Chilwell is a perfectly good asset who seems to be at least rid of some temporary injury concerns. So Chilwell seems to be the priority asset there for me, and Trent just got a rest, so I'm not going to downgrade him. But it is a bit concerning to see this Liverpool team rotate, even though they don't really have many other cups and fixtures to worry about outside of the Premier League. But that is a concern that we have to kind of monitor as well with someone like Trent. And that's going to be the defense for this week. As far as the goalkeepers, we're now moving to a landscape where Fulham assets such as Leno become interesting. I don't really recommend, let's say, a defender, because the huge benefit of a player like Leno is the fact that he can rack up a lot of saves. So if we look at someone like Raya, you'll see that I've removed Henry and players like me from the cheat sheet, but it's interesting to play Raya because he can get so many save points even in tough fixtures. Now, Game Week 30 and 31 aren't going to be tough fixtures necessarily for Brentford. However, I just see the ceiling being much higher for keeping options like Leno and like Raya, because they can rack up saves even though they could lose their clean sheet, which is probably likely the case over the next few fixtures. As far as Leno as well, the benefit that you'll have is also that double game week in 34. So he becomes a little bit more appealing than options like Kepa. However, Steele for me is still the priority asset to get in this sort of elite position of going for budget keepers, just because he's so cheap and it seems like he's going to be nailed for the rest of the season. As far as the 5.0 plus assets, I've simply added Ederson to the cheat sheet. The reason why Ederson is such a priority asset for me is because someone like Ederson will always be nailed. Stones can be rotated, Diaz can be rotated, Ake can be rotated. We know this is the case, and Pep will never start, let's say, 3 or 4 banks of players continuously game after game when there's only 2 to 3 days of rest, when he has such a great bench and such great depth in his arsenal. So that's going to be my concern there, and I think that's why Ederson will become a priority transfer for a lot of managers going forwards, and I can't really see why he would be the incorrect decision. Earlier in the season, we saw that Ederson really struggled to keep clean sheets, but you have to somewhat back the underlying numbers. City are still a very, very good defense, and Ederson is still capable of getting clean sheets. So I still see the value of going for Ederson, particularly if you were to capitalize on Man City's future double game week fixtures. So that's kind of my position on Ederson for now, but I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and I'll see you guys in the next video.